Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we build commander decks without breaking the bank. As usual, this is your host Grazzet, and today we'll be building a budget brew featuring the minigame enabling Chocobo from Final Fantasy IX, Choco, Seeker of Paradise. But before we continue, please do consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you enjoy this content, and if you really like it, also consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee to help keep me caffeinated, or through my Game Nerds affiliate link to net me those sweet kickbacks for any purchases made through them to help fuel my caffeine addiction that way, both in the description below. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commander won last week's poll, and which ones you'll be voting on next to have a build of their own. Now, with all that shilling out of the way, let's kick off this deck tech by taking a deeper look at its commander and how we're going to be building around them. Choco, Seeker of Paradise is a 3/5 bird that costs 1 and Bant that has the following abilities. Firstly, whenever one or more birds we control attack, we may look at that many cards off the top of our deck, putting up to one of those cards into our hand, then putting any lands from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and finally sending the rest to our graveyard. And secondly, as a landfall effect, Choco gains +1/+0 until end of turn whenever a land we control enters. Taking a closer look at the strengths our commander brings to the table, first and foremost is his ability to provide us with insane amounts of ramp in the form of extra land drops, with his first ability generally allowing us to get at least one extra land drop on our turn as we build up our bird army, and then, once we've properly grown our flock, netting us 2, 3, and 4+ extra land drops for the extra mana production and landfall triggers. And this even comes with pseudo draw in the form of letting us keep one of the cards we reveal, helping mitigate the somewhat annoying forced graveyard filling tied to our commander's ability, more on that later, and further procs his own landfall-based offensive power-ups so he can punch in above his weight should the opportunity present itself. Now of course, this is tied to our ability to attack in with birds, but seeing as this tribe has access to many cheap and naturally evasive bodies, we should generally have no issue establishing a board that can safely crack in and begin generating us value as soon as our commander comes down, all of which makes Choco an excellent source of bird-themed land-based and generic value. That said, Paradise won't be that easy to find for our commander, as, just like with most value-focused commanders, our opponents likely won't be kind enough to just sit there and let us generate value turn after turn, and will likely start throwing removal his way once too many lands start coming down, or even preemptively if we have too many landfall payoffs in play to prevent us from running away with the game. Then there's also the matter of Choco's own lack of evasion, which while accurate for a Chocobo, does make it more difficult for him to repeatedly proc his own effect once boards have been established. And then we must also consider the graveyard filling aspect of Choco's ability, which is mandatory and will be sending more and more playables into our bin as our flock grows, meaning we'll want to have both ways to prevent our commander from being removed easily, enough tribal bodies to reliably proc his land ramp, and ways to use our graveyard as a resource if we want to make the most out of Choco's kit. So, after taking all of this into consideration, it shouldn't come as any surprise that our primary game plan for this build will be focused around bird tribal, as we'll be wanting as many birds in play and swinging in each turn to get the maximum usage out of Choco's land ramping capability. This of course means we'll be running both bird and, to a lesser extent, flying support pieces to generate further value from and to empower our evasive tribe members, in-tribe ways to pad our core stats so we can field even more birds, and bird token generators alongside them to further establish our aerial superiority. Then, for our deck's secondary game plans, we'll also be focusing on the lands matter aspect of the build, including a variety of landfall payoffs to net us even more value as our lands come down, alongside green's usual land-focused ramp to get us even more lands into play, as well as our build's ability to generate value from our graveyard, which will not only enable us to benefit from our commander's graveyard setup, but will also make our deck more resilient as a whole when it comes to rebuilding after mass removal and wipes. So let's dive into the world of Final Fantasy IX and make our way to Chocobo's forest, where we'll find our commander Choco and Mean the Moogle, finally at the end of their journey. Having been mistreated by his previous master, Choco had fled to this place to live a more peaceful life, becoming friends with Mean and eventually Zidane, the main protagonist, lending his treasure-finding talents to the latter to not only help him on his quest, but also to find the legendary Chocobo paradise for himself, the mythical utopia for his kind, and eventually he did find it, only to discover that his friend Mean would not be allowed in with him, as only Chocobos could reside there, and when faced with the prospect of paradise without his best friend by his side, he instead decided to return with Mean to Chocobo's forest, as spending the remainder of his life alongside his first and best friend seemed like paradise enough to him already. So, now that we know a bit more about our commander and the game plan for this deck, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the birds we'll be using to support its primary game plan. Seeing as Choco's ability only gets better as we swing in with more birds, we'll be dedicating most of our efforts into slotting in as many birds as we can into this build, prioritizing those that have bird synergies themselves, or at least flying synergies that most of our birds can take advantage of, to either generate more value off of our birds or pump their stats so they can crack in even harder, those that help pad our core stats while keeping our bird count high, and those that bring extra utility to the build outside of that for some added flexibility. So, kicking things off with the in-tribe bird support pieces we'll be running alongside Choco, we'll of course be running Castral the Wind-Crested, who's near perfect in this build as a repeatable way for us to generate card advantage, empower our birds, and even reanimate our birds from the bin as they get in for damage up to 3 times per rotation, making her a perfect piece of both bird and graveyard support. Gwahir the Windlord, whose in-tribe AoE vigilance granting allows us to keep our birds up for blocks, which becomes even better once we've padded their typically low stats with Lords and Anthems, and we can generally cast for 4 thanks to our wide array of mass draw, and Bartz and Boko, who we can also cheat on cost thanks to their built-in affinity for birds, often only costing us double green, and to turn our birds in play into removal when they ETB by having them all deal their damage and power to a single target, which should generally be able to bring down most anything once we've amassed a big enough flock. Then pivoting to the flying support birds we'll be running, which 29 of our bird and non-bird creatures, not counting our bird token generators, will be able to take advantage of. We'll be slotting in both Watcher of the Spheres and Warden of Evocile, both of which reduce the cost of our flying creatures by 1 so that we can get more of our birds into play faster, with the former also temporarily pumping his stats as we get more birds into play, making it particularly deadly on turns we can create lots of bird tokens, alongside Empyrean Eagle, Kangi's Lieutenant, and Kangi's Sky Warden, all of which empower our flyer stats so they can hit even harder. The first being a standard Lord that provides a blanket +1/+1 increase to all our flyers, the second only providing a +1/+1 boost to flyers when attacking, but being playable from the bin thanks to Encore, which we can then use to provide an AoE +3/+3 boost to Alpha Strike in with if sent to our bin with Choco or if it was previously destroyed, and the third providing an AoE +2 toughness boost when blocking and an AoE +2 power boost when attacking, which combines very nicely with our vigilance granting sources to make the most of our birds on both offense and defense. Now, moving on to the in-tribe core stat improving entries we'll be running to better enable Choco while padding said stats. We'll be adding in Birds of Paradise and Gilded Goose as a pair of in-tribe mana dorks, the former being expensive but still within budget as a source of all our colors for fixing and ramp, and the latter being a slightly worse imitation of the first that can do the same, or we can alternatively use to generate food with all our excess mana if we need the life gain, as well as the Revi Imperial Tactician for some less traditional ramp, who will be primarily using to untap our lands as our birds get in for damage so that we can cast more spells, but we can alternatively use to provide said birds with pseudo-vigilance if we need the blockers instead. Then, as an in-tribe draw package, we'll be slotting in the Goose Mother, whose scalable body and once per turn draw makes her a hard-hitting source of repeatable value, Curiosity Crafter, which works very nicely alongside our bird token generators by turning them into draw as they get in, while its hand size removal limit is much appreciated considering how often we overdraw in this build, and River Hoopu, whose draw admittedly costs a lot, but functions as a low-cost evasive body we can drop early to enable Choco, that later gives us the option to pump our excessive amounts of mana into if we happen to need that draw or the life gain it provides. Then, moving on to our bird-themed removal sources, we have Judge's Familiar, whose Stormless Flutterstorm is more of a deterrent than actual removal, but who's cheap and whose threat of activation slows down our opponents by forcing them to always keep 1 mana open when casting instants or sorceries if they need them to get through. The Flash Speed birds Aven Interrupter and Nimble Obstructionist, the former functioning as a pseudo-remand by forcing an opponent to recast a spell it exiles, while also upping the cost of any spells our opponents cast from the grave or exile, making it a solid stacks piece against those decks, and the latter letting us cycle it to stifle any activated or triggered abilities, arguably making it more limited than your standard counterspell, but still good enough to blank common effects like enter and leave the battlefield abilities, beginning and end of phase effects, and others to provide solid disruption when we need it, or an extra tribal body to proc Choco if we don't. And lastly, Aerial Extortionist, whose ETB and on-attack permanent exiling may only be temporary, but is repeatable and capable of stalling our opponent's key pieces if not dealt with, forcing them to recast them while generating us value every time they do so, and occasionally just passively generating us a lot of draw when we come up against any deck that uses a lot of non-traditional casting. From there, as some secondary game plan enabling tribal entrants, we'll be adding in both Saza's Chocobo and Ambrosia Whiteheart as a pair of landfall payoffs, the former quickly growing into a sizable beatstick as Choco gets all those extra lands into play for us, while the latter we're admittedly running as more of a protection piece to help keep Choco and our other high-value targets protected with its bounce effect, but is still another solid landfall payoff afterwards that can punch well above its weight alongside our commander, as well as the side quest Raise a Chocobo, whose front face provides us with a landfall payoff token and who quickly flips alongside our birds into Black Chocobo, which not only provides us with ramp via fetching any land from our deck directly into play, making it ideal to bring up our utility lands, but then also provides all our birds with the same power empowering landfall effect our commander has, enabling them to deal back-breaking alpha strikes as they crack in to enable Choco. And then as some more graveyard-focused entries, we'll be slotting in Jackdaw Savior, which lets us replace any flyers we lose on the board with smaller ones from our graveyard to make use of any ones that we quote-unquote milled over with our commander or were previously destroyed for added value from our bin, and the Escaping Skyway Robber, whose escape allows us to cast any artifact, instant, or sorcery spells we use to pay for it at no mana cost as it gets in for damage, allowing us to not only get it back from the graveyard when it's sent there via our commander, but potentially a lot of other cards as well for even more graveyard value. And lastly, going over the remaining birds we'll be running to provide the build with some extra utility, we'll be slotting in Essor Wardwing Familiar and Plumecrete Escort as ways to keep Choco alive for longer via the Pseudo Ward 3 and Flash Speed Hexproof they grant respectively, allowing him to stick around for longer to keep generating us value, Ledger Shredder as a repeatable source of card selection and graveyard setup that grows bigger via its easy-to-proc Connive, allowing us to dig deeper for our payoffs while becoming a more and more dangerous evasive beatstick, Ishai Ojatai Dragon Speaker as another ever-growing evasive body, this one growing bigger off of any spells our opponents cast to rapidly become a deadly aerial threat that has to be dealt with, Wingmate Rock as 6/8 worth of stats across 2 bodies if we're able to attack in with any of our evasive creatures, giving us more bodies to proc Choco and to benefit from our payoffs while gaining us life back on top of that as we crack in, Life Creed Duo as another source of repeatable life gain, again taking advantage of our large creature base and token creating capabilities to keep our life totals nice and topped off, Senu Keen-Eyed Protector as even more life gain on a cheap body that we can also use as a source of repeatable scry alongside our decent number of legendary birds, allowing us to stack the deck before we proc Choco to help tilt the odds in our favor, Aven Mind Sensor as a flash speed silver bullet against any kind of tutors our opponents try to use to slow them down considerably as it hangs around on the battlefield, and lastly, Restless Anchorage, which yes, is a land, but we can easily turn into another bird for 3 mana to give us 1 extra body to proc Choco with and to benefit from all our bird and flying payoffs, and whose map token generation is decent upside to let us hit more land drops, fill our bin, and further empower our birds. So, now that we've covered all our in-tribe members we'll be using to enable Choco, let's move on to the out-of-tribe support pieces we'll be running alongside them to make them even better. Despite our birds already having a solid amount of in-tribe support, we'll be aiming to supplement it even more by tapping into non-tribal support pieces for them as well, whether it be through more bird token generation to help build up our board state with, or via tribe-specific and general tribe support that can be applied to our birds for even more value or stat empowerment. So, beginning on the bird token creation side of things, we'll be adding a pair of token creating creatures to our ranks in the form of a Myria Angel, who's a flyer itself to benefit from our flying payoffs, and takes advantage of our commander's extra land drops to build up our flock as more lands come into play, as well as Hermes, Overseer of Elpis, whose non-creature spell-based token creation is harder for us to proc but can still generate a respectable amount of bodies, and can generate us value outside of his token creation by giving us more easy access to scry as our birds crack in, further maximizing our hits off of the top with our commander. And then on the non-creature bird token creating front, we'll be slotting in Flurry of Wings, whose ability to create birds off of any player's attacks lets us drastically increase the size of our flock off of any alpha strikes we or our opponents make, regardless of who's on the receiving end. Chocobo Racetrack, which gives us yet another landfall source of birds that are landfall payoffs themselves, allowing them to punch well above their weight as we make our land drops to make up for their lack of built-in evasion, and, as our last bird token generator, Murmuration, which passively gives us more birds as we cast our spells and makes all our birds stronger on top of that via its AoE stat boost and vigilance granting. Now, moving away from building up our flock and onto ways to generate value off of them, we'll be adding in some additional draw to the build in the form of Airborne Aid and Winged Portent, which draw us cards equal to our birds and flyers respectively to easily refill our hands, the latter allowing us to do so at flash speed to avoid having to discard down immediately on particularly large boards, Seaside Haven, which lets us sack our birds for draw if needed, making it an excellent way to turn our spare bird tokens into card advantage from the convenience of our land slot, and of course Kindred Discovery, which provides us with an absolute insane amount of draw as our birds enter and attack, often more than we know what to do with, but even then we can use to fill our bin with reanimation targets if we're forced to discard. Then as some on-theme ramp sources to help get our birds into play faster while providing additional upside, we'll be running the Tribal Mana Rock Patchwork Banner, which not only gives us access to all our colors for extra mana generation and fixing, but also pumps all our bird stats to give us even more damage in the air, as well as the tribal staple Herald's Horn, whose cost reduction helps us get more birds into play faster, while occasionally also letting us draw an extra tribe member off the top if we get lucky. And then to close out our out-of-tribe support pieces with some miscellaneous support that doesn't fit into our other categories, we'll be adding in Saz Katzroy, who not only gives us access to a bird tutor for added consistency, but can also load up their evasive bodies with +1/+1 counters to increase their damage output, and Path of Ancestry, which gives us yet another source of top deck manipulation to maximize our chances of hitting lands off Choco as we cast our tribe members. So, now that we've gone over all the tribal support we'll be using to support our primary game plan, let's move on to the secondary game plan support we'll be running to take advantage of our extra land drops and graveyard setup, or that we'll simply be using to close out the game alongside our army of birds. Kicking off our secondary game plan support with the landfall payoffs and enablers we'll be using to take advantage of and supplement our commander's extra land drops, we'll be running Philidar Retreat, which we'll be primarily using as a way to distribute AoE +1/+1 counters to our entire board every time we make a land drop, allowing our birds to grow more and more rapidly as we get more of them into play to swing in alongside our commander, along with Emiria Shepherd, which is both a landfall and a graveyard payoff in this build by allowing us to recur and or reanimate permanents as we make our land drops, enabling it to take full advantage of the cards we send to the grave and the lands we put into play via our commander. And of course, because we are in green after all, we'll also be running the ramp package consisting of Farseek, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, and Cultivate, all of which would be generically good as ramp and fixing in any build with green in it, but are extra good here by enabling extra landfall triggers for our payoffs while ramping and fixing us. Then switching gears to the graveyard-centric portion of our secondary game plan, we'll be adding in Savine's Reclamation, which can reanimate a good portion of our in and out of tribe permanents while being usable from our hand and the bin via its flashback, giving us the flexibility to mill it over with Choco if we have a better option to add to hand while still having access to an upgraded version of it in our graveyard, along with the mass reanimation suite consisting of Ascend from Avernus, Storm of Souls, and Dusk to Dawn, all of which allow us to reanimate all or a good portion of our tribe members from the bin to build or rebuild our board with. The first allowing us to reanimate all our creatures, but requiring a lot of mana to do so, which our commander and ramp sources help us to get to fairly reliably. The second reanimating all our creatures as 1/1 flyers, which doesn't matter to us too much since most of our birds have relatively low power anyway, and the flying added to our non-naturally evasive creatures allows them to benefit from our flying payoffs, and the third reanimating only power 2 or less creatures with its aftermath, which isn't too bad since we're running 20 of them in this build, while also giving us the option to use it as a wipe if cast normally, making it a flexible target that we can either put into our hand or send to the bin with Choco depending on what we need at the time. And lastly, as a non-tribal finisher to help us close out games, we'll be running Beastmaster's Ascension, which may not be a landfall or graveyard support piece, but does take advantage of our large evasive creature base and token creation to come online the same turn it comes down to provide them with a massive stat boost. And since it's only CMC 3 and a permanent, we have multiple ways to recur and reanimate it to make it even harder for our opponents to permanently deal with it. So, now that we've gone over all the game plan specific cards in the build, let's wrap up this deck tech by going over the generic core stat pieces we'll be running as well as our land base. Starting with our generic ramp pieces, we'll just be running Soul Ring and Arcane Signet, which between them, our land ramp, and the flying and bird cost reducers we're already running should be more than sufficient to generate the mana we need. Then moving straight into our removal package, since we won't be running any generic draw in this build, we'll be adding in both Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares as dirt cheap non-destruction creature removal to help us deal with otherwise resilient threats, Beast Within and a Generous Gift as some flexible removal that can deal with a wide array of different permanent threats for extra coverage, and the Spell Disruption suite of An Offer You Can't Refuse, Arcane Denial, and Counter Spell, all of which provide us with cheap ways to protect our board from wipes and removal, while also giving us a way to interrupt our opponent's game-winning plays if we need to. And then, as our only other board wipe to round out our core stat pieces, we have Austere Command, whose ability to customize what it destroys provides exceptional flexibility that will ideally maximize the damage it inflicts to our opponent's boards, while limiting the damage it does to ours. Then quickly going over our mana lands, we have Command Tower and Seaside Citadel for easy access to all our colors, Exotic Orchard as more access to colored mana off our opponent's lands, all 3 Pain lands in our colors for reliable untapped access to our colors when we need it, all 3 check lands in our colors for generally untapped access to the mana we need thanks to the number of basics and basic land type lands we're running, both battle lands in our colors to again provide more untapped access to our colored mana while also being fetchable by our non-basic land ramp sources thanks to their built-in land types, and 2 land type tap lands for even more reliable fetching and fixing that also helps enable our check lands. We'll then also be running the slow fetches Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and Tranquil Landscape, which count for 2 land drops alongside our landfall payoffs for extra value generation on top of the reliable fixing they provide. Then, for utility lands, we'll be running Reliquary Tower, which gives us a land-based way to protect ourselves from overdrawing with all the sources of card advantage we have access to in this build, along with Demolition Field, which is technically another slow fetch for the double land drop and fixing, while also giving us access to spot land destruction so we can deal with our opponent's utility lands if needed. And lastly, we'll be running 6 plains, 6 islands, and 3 forests as our basics to fill out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the contents of this deck, let's take a look at this build's final breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 33 cards that are either birds themselves or can turn themselves into birds, alongside 7 sources of bird tokens, giving us plenty of tribal bodies to enable our commander with, 12 cards that care about birds, and 6 cards that care about flyers, as well as 10 cards that can bolster all or some of our bird stats and or grant them keywords, giving us a decent number of ways to generate more value off of our birds alongside our commander and to empower them so they can swing in even harder in the air. And lastly, 12 cards that care about lands and 9 cards that care about the graveyard, enabling us to generate value off of Choco's effect, whether he's putting lands into play or sending cards into our bin. For general deck stats, our final build has 15 ramp sources, 11 card draw sources, 13 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, leaving us with an overall balanced selection of core stats with no drastic amount of outliers in any category. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.14, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that should have no issues casting our bigger spells thanks to the extra land drops our commander gets into play for us and its existing ramp package. The final price of this deck then totals out to be $64.36, not counting the price of basic lands, taxes, or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, for some side grade considerations that don't increase this deck's cost, we can consider exchanging Aerial Extortionist in favor of Twanos the Toy Maker if we'd rather have the capability of creating copies of our birds over repeated removal and draw, which admittedly can be powerful, though do keep in mind this deck does contain a decent amount of legendaries and non-birds that can't really make use of his effect. Or, alternatively, we can replace Beastmaster's Ascension with Mockingbird if we'd rather have a cheaper and easier to recur tribe member that we can use to copy our opponent's best creatures with over the game-ending potential of its predecessor. Then, if we're looking to upgrade this deck further by increasing the budget, we can consider replacing Kangi's Lieutenant with Soulcatcher's Aerie, which may take a bit to get online, but can provide a much bigger stat boost to all our birds as they get picked off to really pile on the damage, or slot out River Hoopoe in favor of Traveling Chocobo, which is a lot more expensive and not evasive, but fits perfectly into this build as both an on-theme way for us to play tribe members and lands off the top of our deck for added card advantage, while also doubling all our landfall triggers for even more value. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Yuna was able to claim the top spot, so look forward to a counter-theme build featuring her coming soon. Then moving on to this week's poll, it's time to give some of the primary antagonists from the Final Fantasy series some love, with this week's contenders being the Mad God from Final Fantasy VI, Kefka Court Mage, the Master Manipulator from Final Fantasy IX, Kuja Genome Sorcerer, the Walking Calamity from Final Fantasy X, Sin Spira's Punishment, and the Revenge-Consumed Immortal from Final Fantasy XV, Arden the Usurper. So be sure to cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, before the deadline on June 27th, and let me know in the comments who you voted for, and which commanders from this set you'd like to see me feature in future polls. And before we go, as usual, please do like, comment, and subscribe to help keep the almighty algorithm appeased. Consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee or buying product through my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to throw a few bucks my way so I can continue making this content. And if you want to see more content like this, be sure to check out all my other deck techs either floating around my head or on the playlist above. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.